Hello, everyone, and welcome to Dreamleapers with Harriet Cole. I'm so happy to be with you today, and boy, do I have an incredible guest, someone I met in my happy place on the beach in Sag Harbor. He was having a book signing in Sag Harbor this summer, and I ran into a woman who had met him, I believe, at that book signing. I've known her for many years, and she introduced me to this wonderful author who definitely has an incredible way with words, and I want to tell you about him right now. He is Burundi-born author Pacifique Irankunda, and Pacifique arrived in America from Burundi, which is in East Africa, at only 19 years old. He was a scholarship student at Deerfield Academy. Well, he has an incredible story of what it took to get him here to this country and so many great things about his country, Burundi, and he's written a book about it. It's called The Tears of a Man Flow Inward, Growing Up in the Civil War in Burundi. And in this book, he explores his childhood experiences as well as the struggles that he faced during the Civil War in his home country. It is a beautifully told story. Clearly, storytelling is a big part of not only Pacifique's world and his life, but also the community and country from where he hails, Burundi. So please join me in welcoming Pacifique Irankunda. Hi there.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Oh, I'm so happy to have you and so happy that we met. It was fortuitous for us to meet. And so I know we're going to read some of the book, but before we do that, I want you to talk a little bit about you as a writer, because I'm a writer too. And first of all, from the cover, from the title, your book has the title has lyricism in it. You know, it's very poetic, just the very title of your book, which I'll tell everyone again, The Tears of a Man Flow Inward, Growing Up in the Civil War in Burundi. When did you know that you were a writer? When did that occur for you? Like for me, I knew when I was 12 years old.
Yeah.
Early on. I was writing poetry. I wasn't writing books at that point, but I knew like something in me had to write. For you, when did this begin?
It began when I was at Deerfield Academy, but going back, I believe that I became a writer before I actually really became aware of it. I was exposed to it, as you mentioned, in Burundi. We had a very strong tradition of storytelling, and I wrote about this in my book in a chapter called "The Times of Stories." So basically, every evening was a story time. But when I came to Deerfield Academy in Massachusetts, I was 19. That's when I began writing stories down, trying to turn my memories into stories. And I remember the first story I wrote was called The Color of the Sound. And a friend of mine and a wonderful writer named Tracy Kidder included that story in a book called Good Prose that he and his friend Richard Todd wrote together. And in this book, they write that the ultimate reward of memoir may be to produce facts, a work in which the facts are preserved but the experience transformed. And that's what I was really trying to accomplish in my writing. And for me to see him including my piece in a book called Good Prose, that gave me confidence that I can continue, that I can write professionally. So he was a big influence on me. And then I do remember that even when I began working on my book, there is a favorite passage from Good Prose, which I thought about often when I was working on my own memoir. And the passage goes like this, that if you can go back to the source and see your memories whole, you can create truer versions of what you remember. You tell the stories accurately and artfully as your abilities allow. And if you succeed, you replace the fragments of memory with something that has its own shape and meaning, a separate thing that has value in itself. The delight of memoir, it's like the delight of a woodworker may feel when putting the finishing touches on a beautiful desk. The desk is different from the wood forever, and the good memoir is different from the actual experience, from the memories behind it. Not a variation of them, but different, and different, of course, from the actual experience that gave birth to both memory and the memoir. So for me, it was really a way that I began to travel back in my childhood and connect that story, tradition of storytelling, uh, and instead of telling stories orally, then I sit down to write them in my book, and it's a way to continue my and also honor this tradition and my elders of their, in their stories of what used to be.
It's interesting that you say, about the capturing of the memories, because as a reader, as I'm reading your book, you really do take us into these experiences. So you can tell that you spend a lot of time um, recalling these moments, the lessons from Mama Clements and the lessons from uh, both your family, the community, what was happening around you, through a child's eyes. We really do get to see what you experienced through these memories, and they're so incredibly vivid. So I'm curious, when you said it was after you were at Deerfield Academy, you're 19. That's kind of a coming of age time too. You're becoming a young man and you're looking back. In those early days, as you were looking back at your story, what got you to even come to America after going through so much, was it difficult for you to remember some of these things, because you were indeed living in a civil war? Was it hard for you to have some of those memories, to recall some of those things?
It was very difficult. It depended on what kind of memories. And when I began writing, part of one of the reasons was to cope with those memories. Uh, but there were some beautiful memories that I had. I do write about books. I mean, I do write about cows in one of my chapters, and those were really pleasant memories. And in recording the tradition self of storytelling, that was also a good memory. That was something that I enjoyed remembering and writing about. In fact, I will just read you a small passage
Oh,
from
sure. Please do.
the last chapter that I described called the Times of Stories. And most of my stories are also told through the lens of a child. When I was a child, most people in Burundi's villages had round houses made of wood and mud with thatched roofs, and inside the house there was a round fireplace built of clay. It had the shape of an inflated tire. Around the fireplace there were usually traditional hand-woven mats on which children would lie or sit, waiting for dinner or bedtime or stories. It was a tradition in Burundi for elders to tell stories to their children, and so in most households, every evening was a story time. Some elders were very good at telling stories, and they were usually known for this beyond the household. They were called the good storytellers, for instance, or the funny old men. These elders were like magnets to children. The way they told the stories was more important than the stories themselves. You might have already heard a story that bored you, but when these elders repeated it, you would be kicking your legs up and pedaling your feet, laughing. The good storytellers could do more than make you laugh. Sometimes a story would become more and more puzzling as they told it, and you'd still be waiting for a revelation when the story ended. The elders seemed to enjoy this effect. They also told sad stories that made my eyes well up with tears. Sad stories often began with "in the old days" or "when I was young," or before you were born, or it used to be. If a story began with the phrase, there once was, there shall never be, you sensed that the story was going to be fictional. Every story had a moral, and every story from the good storytellers was entertaining to me. What was it about these elders who could transform a story that was familiar and even boring into something amusing and intriguing, even moving? I think it was the tone of their voices and the gestures they made with their hands and the suspense they created by reordering the stories. And they surprised you with the words they chose. Sometimes they made the people and the places so vivid you thought those fictional characters were real. All these things dressed up a story, transformed it, and made it a beautiful tale. Now I realize that as a child, I experienced art before I knew the word. So this is a time that when I go back that I really enjoyed, and I felt like I was exposed to that tradition of storytelling early on, which influenced my writing. But obviously, during the war, things became really difficult, and it almost felt like there were two stories of my country, and I remember just to go back and introduce you to even Burundi, where it is, because I remember coming here to America. Some people hadn't even heard of Burundi, and it is a very small country, but
Yeah.
to the north it borders Rwanda, and they like it's almost like a fraternal twin, similar in size and age, with nearly same language and the same ethnic composition. And both countries were colonized by the Germans and then the Belgians, who
And which other country are you speaking of? Burundi and what?
and Rwanda.
Oh,
Rwanda, like
Rwanda. Okay.
Burundi, it's to the north of Burundi is Rwanda, and
Is
they
Rwanda.
yeah, and they went through the same tragedy
Yes.
during that.
And by the way, I think that in the West, anyhow, we heard a lot more about what was happening in Rwanda than in Burundi. I mean, I think there was a lot of press about the genocide in Rwanda and just a lot more exposure. So, your story, your book is shedding light on your country and the things that your country went through that I don't know that as many Americans are familiar with the challenges that your country went through.
No, I do believe I did experience this coming here. A lot of people had heard of Rwanda, but hardly
Right.
people had even heard of Rwanda. Ironically, they both countries really went through the same
The
around
same thing around the same time, right?
the same time. In fact, they started in Burundi. I mean, on Rwanda, it was on much bigger scale and it happened very fast. Whereas in Burundi, it lasted for more than 10 years. But same, similar history, similar ethnic drive, and similar, really very close in many ways.
Yeah. Yeah. Again, that's the power of you're writing a book too, because now more people will be exposed to what happened in your country. Because again, I think a lot of people do know about uh, Rwanda and not as much about Burundi. Let me remind folks that you are listening to Dreamleapers with Harriet Cole. We are so happy today to have with us a writer who's written a beautiful book. He is Pacifique Irankunda, and his book is The Tears of a Man Flow Inward, Growing Up in the Civil War in Burundi. And we're so excited to have Pacifique with us today. So, Pacifique, I'm curious. You mentioned a moment ago the lovely memory of the cows,
Yes.
and you know, and I read with fondness as you're talking about the cows and just the relationship that the community has to cows. The cows were revered, and and like you said in your book, the cows were named. You would name a cow, and then like the lineage of cows in that family would sometimes have the same name, but there was a reverence for them which is very, very different from how cows are raised in the United States for sure. But and only would people eat cows when they had lived their full life as being able to give life in other ways. So, what is the significance of the cow in Burundi culture?
In my country, and that's also true in my neighboring country, the cows were, they had a place of importance in my country's traditions. But beyond that, they were really simply loved. I don't know what it is, but people really, really loved their cows. They are dancing, people imitating the horse. They have a huge long horse from like they can range from 8 feet from tip to tip. And
Wow.
they, girls play this dance imitating the horns, the movement of the cows. And there is even a poetry that is written just to dedicate the cows and the songs and all
Really?
the cows. It's beautiful. I mean, and actually, in a way, the cows. When I was thinking about these old peaceful Burundi back in my country, cows were a sort of a living relic of this all the time because these were the remnants of the time that you could look at them and then still be able to connect.
I'm not hearing you very well.
That the cows were like a living relic of this all the time in Burundi. There were things like we had a really very peaceful society back then before the war and long before the colonialism and all the destruction that followed. So
So they are a symbol of peace and happiness in a country that unfortunately had so much unrest. Can you tell us so that we could get an understanding of what was the rivalry between the Hutu and the Tutsis? Why, to your knowledge, did this civil unrest occur?
I believe it began way before. In my book, I do cover the pre-colonial time and then the colonial time and then what led to the Civil War. And if, at least in my view, and according to what I read and the interviews I had with people and the government officials, I tried to really reach out to as many people as I could. These ethnic divisions go back to the colonial time. They basically, the Belgians and the missionaries, they really basically managed to set up one ethnic group against the other. And at least in Burundi, they excluded the Hutus from the national administration. So there was a justified resentment when the Hutus were excluded from the administration.
And that was during colonial times when the Hutus were not included.
Correct. During the monarchy, back then when Burundi was a kingdom, both Hutus and Tutsis, the Hutus were integrated into the king's national administration. But what was really what the Belgians managed to do that allowed this violence to unfold was the destruction of this institution, the Washington High, which I wrote about in my book. And they existed basically to hold the community together and to sort of guard the raid against the government's abuse of power and the corruption. But once that was destroyed, then one group was favored over the other, and then resentment grew. And after independence, then there was this rival between the two groups, which eventually led to the civil war.
And what is your family? Which group is your family from?
My family is a Tutsi, but the thing that people may not even be aware about outside of Burundi and Rwanda, we really don't. We rarely, say who we are through ethnic terms. Even though there was a war, people prefer to say we are Burundians or we are. They don't really. I suppose especially because of the civil war, that the association of the ethnic group with the civil war. But even before that, ethnicity was not something that people identify themselves by.
It was
But
something that was just part of, like, it was part of the war, so it certainly existed, but
they,
you as individuals didn't make those delineations.
we didn't, people didn't see themselves through those ethnic lens until they were forced to during the colonial time, because you had to carry an identity card with an ethnic labeled on it. And because they were forced to do that, then everything depended on what
Did
your.
you have to do that? Did you have
in,
to have an identity card?
in my childhood I didn't, but others before me did, and
Oh, in
that's,
the past.
yeah, in the past, and that's
Well,
what
see, there's something that you write about in your book about, and I think Mama Clements made the point. You need to look forward. Don't look back. There's that sense of looking forward is the way, the path toward life, and that it's so painful to look back. Now, it's interesting that you make that point, because then with another African group, the Sankofa,
yeah.
the theory is you have to look back in order to be able to know how to go forward. So I'm curious about this notion of, even in your book, because it's memories, you are looking back, but you share at the beginning of your book that, Mama Clements, your mother, was like, no, look forward. This is the way to survive. So there's kind of conflict in this cultural understanding. Can you speak about that?
Yes, I did struggle with that. There was a tension in this conflict of looking back or looking forward. And I begin my book exploring, saying it out, at the front, confronting this dilemma I have. I had to confront that dilemma, and I actually begin my book just saying plainly, they putting the conflict there, the dilemma, this tension between wanting to go forward, to look forward, but at the same time having to look back in order to go forward. And when my mother, Mama Clemence, was saying, go, don't look back, just go look forward, I think she meant not to dwell on what was happening during the Civil War.
Yeah.
And when I was writing my book, I realized how important it was for me during that time to really just focus and go for, not to dwell on what was happening at the time. But interestingly, there is, for my country at least, I feel as if we need to really go way back past the Civil War to the older traditions if we really want to move forward, because that's where lies the foundation or the sort of what I would call the sort of my country, the culture and all that was beautiful that ended up being destroyed during the colonial time. So I do tell different stories, the recent past during the Civil War and the deep past before the Civil War started. And that's where, for me, looking to that past is almost like looking forward for me.
And as you talk about the deep past, this is during the time of the kingdom, right? And when you describe in the beginning of your book about the people of wisdom. I can't remember what that word was, but can you describe? There's this sense of there was a name for people who held the wisdom of the community. What is that name, and what did that mean? Can you describe that for us?
Yes, the name is, they were called the Bashinganai. And it was, in my book, I do describe the Bashinganai, what they did, and the traditions and the origins. But briefly, it was a system of justice, and they permeated the society. The Bashinganai were organized into a formal institutions, and there were different levels, from the village to the king's court. And the members of these institutions were ordinary people, like farmers and the cowherders, but you could not become one of them unless everyone in the village agreed that you were just and trustworthy. And then you had to undergo several years of arduous training. Then those who passed would return back to their village and old occupations, but they were required to intervene in all disputes they encountered. And at least according to many old histories, that the people of Burundi came to rely on such interventions. Selected members became advisors to the princes and the king. The Bashingana were so trusted that villagers would routinely invite them into their homes to mediate family disputes. And they policed themselves with care, and members who transgressed were punished by the Bashingana. And they had a lot of power collectively. If even a simple peasant, and they kept their power by basically preserving their reputation as uncorrupted, even a simple peasant could take the king to the Bashingana formal court. And if it was generally felt that the king was abusing his power, the Bashingana could order the king to stop a policy he was pursuing. And if after counseling to the Bashingana, the king did not mend his ways, the Bashingana had the right and the responsibility to dethrone the king. And when I was studying that, I became convinced that if the Belgians hadn't managed to destroy that institution of the Bashingana, civil war within Burundi would have been nearly impossible, because it was done from all throughout the country, from the community all the way to the king's court.
So when did the Mashungana disband, or when was that no longer part of the culture?
There was that was in the, by the 1960s, between 1884, that's when really the destruction began, and by 1950 it was all gone. It was no longer functioning as an institution.
I mean, there's so many traditions that are part of our culture, and something like that is really, it's sad to lose, because it sounds anyhow better than what the governments are like today. It's like the community of elders who held the space for just how people conducted themselves, which is really powerful. And when you lose some of those traditions and rituals, it creates a hole.
It does, and I feel that we are still living in that. The absence of the Bashingana is very much felt.
But what's amazing is that through storytelling, you learned about it, so you could share the history of it with us. There's a scholar from Burkina Faso who recently passed away. His name was Maladoma Some. I don't know if you ever heard of him, but he wrote a book called Of Water and the Spirit. And he talked about the indigenous culture in Burkina Faso, where he grew up, and the lessons that were taught by the elders, and the way that community was structured. And he wrote this book with the notion to help Westerners learn. There's incredible wisdom to be learned from indigenous African cultures that we could use in society today. And this sounds very similar. This sense of the communities, the elders in the community holding government and holding the wisdom and helping people to understand how to behave or not, holding people accountable for their behavior, is incredibly powerful. And every time I hear about an indigenous African culture, like from back in the day, not recent past, but historical past, there's some nugget like what you just shared that is included.
Thank you. Yes, I still have the hope, and that's really where the power of storytelling and the writing comes in. I still have a hope that people will go back to that, because it hasn't, it's still within us. It's still shared through stories, and even when the institution itself was destroyed, I was able to witness people who stood as Bashingana in the spiritual sense, trying to intervene during the war. In fact, my mother was one of them, and I do tell her story in my book. and I was
Well,
able.
yeah, I read a story again in the beginning, which is very powerful for a lot of reasons, but how your mother carried herself in a certain way. And a lot of the soldiers or the people uh, who were on the front lines of the Civil War were kids. They were young.
I know. Yes,
And they were bullying you guys, the other kids. But when your mom walked up, they realized they had to treat her with respect.
they did. And
Yeah, which is so powerful. And so many places around the world, especially in African countries, but not just, the militia are young people. They're really young. They're told they have to do this. And it's really kind of sad to see what's happening with putting young people on the front lines like that. But an elder like Mama Clemence would be able to say, you have to behave.
in fact, if you don't mind, I will read you a short passage where I tell exactly that story of how she handled soldiers during the war.
Excellent. So what's the name of the chapter, and then you can read it.
It's called Maman Clemence, the chapter of my book. It's called the Maman Clemence.
Go for it.
My brother Asfert and I had fled into the mountains and were staying at a refugee camp guarded by the government soldiers. The self-appointed ruler of the place was a soldier named Minani. He was a martinet. He and his assistant liked to walk around with sticks, which they used to beat up people, including some of their own soldiers. When they caught a militiaman, they would torture him in public while everyone was watching, and no one would dare to interfere. This was happening one day when the mayor happened to pass by. He stopped and had a brief conversation with Minani. But while they talked, the militiaman lay in the gutter with his hands and feet tied together. And as the mayor walked away, Minani and his assistant went back to beating the militiaman. And then, in the midst of all this, Maman Clemence appeared at the top of the hill above the road. She had come from Kigutu, bringing food for me and Asvert. When Minani saw her, he looked alarmed and said to his assistant and other soldiers standing around, "Get him out, get him out." It was very clear. Minani wanted them to get the militiamen out of the gutter and out of sight. Before Mama Clemence got close enough to see that Minani and his assistant had been torturing the militiamen. As the soldiers did this, hurriedly, Minani and his assistant slowly walked away from the scene, strolling uphill toward Mama Clemence, as if they were simply patrolling the village, pretending nothing had happened. When their paths met, Maman Clemence greeted them, saying, "How are you, Vane?" The word Vane literally means children, but is also used as a word of endearment when used by someone's your parents' age. Minani and his assistant replied politely, calling her Mama and saying that they were fine, then making small talk. This was the first time I realized Minani and his comrade were capable of respecting someone. There had been consistency in their intimidating behavior, but now they were the ones who seemed to bow. The crowd noticed. Why would the village martinets hide the incident from Maman Clemence when they didn't even hide it from the mayor? They who intimidated everyone. Why was it that they were afraid of Maman Clemence? They who seemed to respect no one. What was it about her that they respected? The fact that just one individual's appearance in a large crowd could change the atmosphere entirely. This seems to me like evidence that there was something about Maman Clemence, something greater than the power that Minani and his comrade had imposed on everyone else in the refugee camp. In retrospect, I think it was the fact that she did not see them as soldiers, but as other children, and that she held them to the same standards that she expected her own children to meet. These were things that she seemed to have completely internalized. I had witnessed other occasions when she saw soldiers retreating somebody. She never simply walked by. She would talk to the soldiers as if she were talking to her own children. She was telling them, in effect, that what they did had to be a mistake. Otherwise, they would not have acted in a manner that was, in her eyes, inhuman. It seemed as if she had her own good image of them, as if she were asking them, how come you just made such a terrible mistake? For them, I think this mistake had been normalized and integrated into their way of behaving. People around them expected this behavior, and this encouraged it. But for these soldiers to be told by someone who seemed to care for them that what they were doing was wrong and out of character was, I think, a compliment to them and uplifting. And I believe that's why even Minani and his assistant wanted to hide from her the fact that they had just been torturing another human being, committing what she would call a terrible mistake.
That, I didn't know that this was the section that you were going to read when I mentioned this earlier, but it was so powerful. Like, the humanity is what Mama Clemence invoked in them. And as you describe in that chapter, you see them just moments before abusing others. And, there's a fine line between treating people with respect and abuse. And you show that in your book. And it's powerful to look at, but also I think the fact that your mother had that much presence and power shows that at least there was the potential for invoking that humanity, even in the worst of circumstances. So she was a powerful woman.
That's what really gives me hope that it
Yeah.
hasn't died. It's still in us, in individuals, and there is a chance that this movement can be revived.
So you grew up during the time of Civil War. You got to see, like, on the one hand, you have a lovely childhood. On the other hand, there are these moments when you don't know if you're going to survive because there are soldiers standing in the way, or there are people who are saying, no, we're in a war, and the harmony and the wonder of childhood is gone when you aren't sure what your next steps will lead you to. How did you sleep at night, as a kid, knowing that there is war happening right where you live? And you even describe how your family kind of moved around, and other families too, just to try to be safe. How did you find peace?
Um, it was difficult childhood. As you say, there were moments that were really present that felt I can go back the tradition of storytelling that I described when we would be all gathered around the fireplace or when I would be looking after cows. But for the most part, it was a terrifying moment for me. Oftentimes we had to leave our village and they go to stay with other families or sometimes in a refugee camp, but we didn't really stay in a refugee camp for more than 2 months or 3 months at most. We would come back. What was really difficult was for my mother to send us to school. There was an elementary school we would go to, and every time there was a path we would cross going to school and coming back. And that same path, they were during the war, militiamen crossed the very same path we would cross going to school. So there was a likelihood that we'd run into them, and when we did, that meant we were pretty much gone. So my mother would accompany us to going to school in the hope that we would come back. So every single day, you just went to school really feeling scared that you may not be able to come back. But she found the courage to send us to school nonetheless.
You know, when you mentioned that, there was a documentary that I saw a few years ago. I think it's called On the Way to School. It's a French documentary, and it looks at about 5 different groups of children in different parts of the world, and just the effort that it took them to get to school. You know, some people, little kids, you know, running through the bush and they could run into elephants, and others who, you know, have to ride horseback for miles and miles and miles because they were in a really remote area. In India, there was a group of kids, and one of the kids was disabled, and they had made a vehicle for this little kid out of discarded bike tires and a box because they had no money. But what it showed, which I appreciated so much, Pacifique, is the thirst for education, and how no matter what, like you're saying, your mom was like, you will get educated. And you make that point very clearly in your book. No matter what, you will get educated because education opens so many doors. And that was what was shared in this book. And I'm sure you've been in this country for a long time, and you know the fervor for education is not as great in all of our communities. Some it is in America, but like education is so easily accessible. And there are a lot of kids who don't go to school. There are a lot of kids who don't have that drive. And I don't know, when I hear your story and others, when I saw that film, it had a tremendous impact on me just to remind all children there is an opportunity to grow and to expand your mind and your life if you make the effort to get educated. And in your case, you know, crossing militia, that was scary, right?
Yeah, it was really scary. But that's what I respect about my mother, her drive and the belief in education. And now I'm really grateful because, you
Of
know, it
course.
changed, it opened the doors. Uh, and going back in just having to walk those 6 miles every single day to school, in
Yeah.
addition to the danger that we had to face going and coming back. But now, you know, I can reflect back and feel like I can contribute something to society. And that's,
And so going to Deerfield Academy, so coming from Burundi
yeah.
to Connecticut or Massachusetts. Um, how did that decision get made?
My older brother was already at Deerfield, so in a way, it starts with him because I was mostly following his footsteps. But he was applying to colleges in Burundi. Most students apply to, if they want to go abroad, they apply to colleges, say in France or Belgium, in Francophone countries, because we speak French as a second language. So it's easier to go to those French-speaking countries. But he, for some reason, wanted to come study in the States. And a friend of ours who ended up being a host family for us when we first came here reached out to a college advisor at Deerfield Academy. And that's when the connection started. She was recruiting students from Africa, and she came to Burundi. And my brother, she met my brother, and my brother applied, and he was accepted. And then I followed in his footsteps. Basically, that's how my story of coming to Deerfield.
I love it. Let me remind folks, you are here with me at Dreamleapers with Harriet Cole. So very happy to be here today with the author Pacifique Irankunda. He's from Burundi. He has written an incredible book, The Tears of a Man Flow Inward, growing up in the civil war in Burundi. And this book is filled with amazing stories. As he's told us, storytelling is such a big part of his culture, and we're grateful for it because you have so many incredible stories in your book, Pacifique. What do you hope that readers will take from your book? What do you hope will happen as people read your book?
I hope that they will find the value of what is left in my country. Frankly, to be honest, when I set out to write this book, before I made the commitment to write the book, I had been offered the book contract, but I already knew that revisiting those memories was really painful. So I wasn't willing to do that. I was just happy writing for myself. I enjoyed, writing about art, writing about the traditional storytelling. But I thought that if I could make this sacrifice and tell the story as articulate that concept of the Bashing and also tell the story of what happened when they were no longer serving, when they were no longer in the society, and they, share the brutalities and the horror of the violence during the Civil War. I was hoping that people would see one, what is left and what's possible. Maybe they would do something about it. I'm still hoping that it's not really lost, that concept of the machine gun, trying to build communities and allow children to be children. And they grow up and they be able to dream, live their lives, instead of being caught up in these recurrent conflict. And I see that it's not even only in my country, it's really widespread, and there is almost like a crisis. People having to flee constantly on the move, fleeing from the conflict, from the violence. And yet we had this beautiful system that had been established, that had flourished. And there is a way that, we hadn't roasted that. We still can bring that back. And that's what I hope people will be able to get out of my book, rather than the stories of the war. It's not really the main. I had to tell that part to show the importance of the Bashingana, what they prevented when they still were in the society.
So you mentioned that your brother had gone to Deerfield Academy before you. In your book, you share with us that you are the 9th child that Mama Clements had. How many of your siblings have gone to other countries? At least you and your brother. Where's the rest of your family today?
They are. I have 5 siblings in the States, in the US, in America, and the others are in Canada, Montreal. And my mother was actually an only child, but for some reason she decided to make up for her loneliness.
Is she still living?
No, she unfortunately passed away, and also my father. And they all together they had. My father passed away a few years before my mother, and I was able to see her. She came to our graduation, and they sent all of us children to school, and we graduated from college. So that was we have.
Well, and you also you speak a lot in your book about the strength of your mother. You also share some really painful stories about your father, which are very common here in the States too. When there's so much conflict and inability to have control, a lot of people resort to addiction. And you described that your father was addicted to alcohol, and it was really hard for your family. Unfortunately, that happens sometimes when circumstances are incredibly challenging. Did he ever find peace in his life?
I think so. In fact, I wish I had been able to tell all the stories and their complexities.
Sure.
I do realize that there were a lot of things that I didn't know about him that I came to learn afterward. He was really committed to the community. So all the times he was absent at home, and what he saw in the community, trying to deal with, when there was a war, people would flee, but he never fled. He would stay there upon the community because he saw a lot of things. So he kept it to himself. He didn't share. He never talked about what he witnessed his commitment to the community. And now is what is the fruit of what he did back then is what I see now. I wish I had been able to tell that story, but I'm still like about it now. But I think for me as a child, I would have liked to see him home, helping with my mom and care for us. But of course,
Sure.
it's a city. Now as a grown up, I realized that he had other responsibilities to a sacrifice he made
Sure.
for the community, but that had a toll on my family.
So one more question before we go. Like you described, your siblings, you and your siblings are in other parts of the world. I'm sure that's true for other families as well. What has happened to Burundi? Because, when you have civil war, so many people flee. What's happening now? What is culture like now? Who is there now? How are people living?
In Burundi, the war has stopped. There is no violence going on right now, but a lot of things are really stagnant. There is no moving forward, and especially the youth, they continue going abroad to seek opportunities elsewhere. But in my village, one of my older siblings returned home and they built, schools and the hospitals, and it's really vibrant, but in this very small community. But for
So
the
there are some people who are rebuilding.
yes, there are some in very isolated parts of the country, but there is that spirit of wanting to, to rebuild the country, and hopefully the country at large will come back together. That's my hope.
Yeah. Unfortunately, that is often a byproduct of, civil war, and not even just. I mean, sometimes it's just strife that
Yeah.
is not all the way a war. But when the brain trust leaves, it's really difficult to rebuild. So thank God for your brother who's gone back. I hope more people will go back too and help to rebuild what sounds like a beautiful culture. Thank you so much for sharing your story with us. Thank you for writing your book. I want everybody to know it's just a beautiful read. You're a really great writer. Are you working, is your work as a writer now?
Yes, that's what I'm focused on, hoping to make it as writer. Yes, that's my
And before writing your book, is that what you were doing?
yes, that's what I was doing.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, good luck to you. Thank you for writing your book. Let me remind folks the book is called The Tears of a Man Flow Inward, Growing Up in the Civil War in Burundi. And our author, Pacifique Irankunda, who's been with us today. Thank you. I'm so glad we met. And thank you for sharing your story with us, and good luck to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you again for having me.
Great. Well, thank you for tuning in to Dreamleapers with Harriet Cole. Hope you will pick up a copy of this book. It really is a beautifully told story, a story about a country that we don't know that well. So pick up this book. It is, once again, let me tell you, it is called The Tears of a Man Flow Inward, Growing Up in the Civil War in Burundi. And until next time, have a great day and make it count.